Hello class, so I'm back and I want to cover the work that we were writing on for a defense of ethical objectivism by Louis P. Pojman. And so we have a series of questions. Show and define how ethical relativism is associated with ethical objectivity for Pojman. B, what is subjectivism according to Pojman? C, what is conventionalism according to Pojman? Describe Pojman's critique of ethical relativism. So I went ahead and opened the paper here. So here we're looking at Pojman's work. And so remember to always double check the spelling of the philosopher's name. I had a couple of students that were misspelling his name, and in one case it was actually kind of funny in the sense that the student had spelled it Pojam, but it is Pojman. And so let's take our first question. Show and define how ethical relativism is associated with ethical objectivity. So really, this is taken care of once we look at this argument here that Pojman highlights in this subchapter, an analysis of relativism, and really an analysis of ethical relativism. So he's highlighting this scholar, John Ladd, who has this argument whereby we're understanding ethical relativism. And so this is the argument for ethical relativism, okay? And so when we're defining ethical relativism, we need to be sure to account for how all of this is understood. So what I mean by that is that students often will define relativism as only this first part here, right to the comma. So moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society. Okay, or that something like individual morals vary. Okay, or that morality is subjective. So notice that that's only the first part of the sentence there. So in other words, even this first premise of the argument continues, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. So that's really the biggest problem. I have difficulty understanding why it is that students will only focus on the first part and not show the second part, because the second part of that sentence really is the account for objectivity there. Okay, so in other words, relativism is moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. So that's a definition of ethical relativism, and more specifically also a definition of conventionalism. But let's continue through the argument. So whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on or is relative to a society which they belong. So this here too, you could tell, doesn't necessarily have the objective account there. Okay, so this is still another one of these ways in which we think of relativism as only containing this part of the sentence. Okay, and also think of the way he's referring to societies here as conventionalism, which is otherwise known as ethical, cultural relativism. Okay, and then so 3, which is the conclusion, therefore there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. So in other words, the relativist is making the claim that moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary, so there are no universal standards held by all societies. Okay, so This is the diversity thesis. In other words, societies are all different, so therefore there's not a moral standard that holds between them. This second premise, which he's referring to as the dependency thesis, is that uh, morality depends on the society to which they belong. Okay? And then you must also understand that to define ethical relativism, you must have this component that there are no absolute or objective standards that apply to all people everywhere. That's the complete definition. Okay. So in other words, students often give me half of this, not the objective part. So when you look at my question, show and define how ethical relativism is associated with ethical objectivity, students still want to hold these two separate. I'm not quite sure why, but they're not. Okay. They're not separately understood as a definition for relativism. So in other words, objectivity is a part of how relativism is understood because the relativist is skeptical of the objectivity. Okay, that holds. So let's go to subjectivism. So we really could just look at this, where subjectivism is really this same argument whereby we substitute societies for individuals. So, in other words, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from person to person. So there are no universal standards held by all people. So that's subjectivism, right? So whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on our personal view. So our subjective view is then what we would have that as. And then therefore there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. Okay, so that's more or less a definition of subjectivism. So there, the morality is reliant on the individual. Okay, so then let's go to what is conventionalism. So we've already answered that. So not only is this a definition of ethical relativism, it's also a definition of conventionalism. Okay, it's an argument in favor of relativism, ethical relativism, that's also exemplary of an argument for conventionalism or cultural relativism. Now, we must remember, though, first and foremost, Pojman's paper is titled In Defense of Ethical Objectivism. So he is not a relativist. Students want to write this, that, well, they read this and then they're thinking, well, therefore he's a relativist, right? No, he's showing you what relativism is in order to illustrate the problem. So there we have A, B, and C answered. Now let's look to question D, describe Pojman's critique of ethical relativism. So we need to go down to page 5. And here we have an argument on tolerance. So Pojman is highlighting this anthropologist's argument of Melville Herskovits. If morality is relative to a culture, then there's no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own. If there's no independent way of criticizing any other culture, then we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Morality is relative to culture, therefore we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So this is the mistaken view, according to Pojman, that Melville Herskovits has in favor of cultural relativism. Okay, and so Pojman shows right here, tolerance certainly is a virtue, but is this a good argument for it? I think not. If morality simply is relative to each culture, then if each culture in question does not have a principle of tolerance, its members have no obligation to be tolerant. So, in other words, Herskovits seems to be treating the principle of tolerance as one exception to his relativism. So, in other words, the cultures, he's implying, should be tolerant of one another, But the problem is if morality is relative, then even tolerance itself would then be rendered relative, because tolerance itself is not an objective standard if you are a relativist. So therefore, tolerance in and of itself serves as a contradiction to Herscovitz's argument. So if you pointed out something like that, that would answer Pojman's critique of ethical relativism. That's one way to critique relativism. And the other way was just that objectivity prevails. So if we're thinking of ethical objectivity, easiest answer to what ethical objectivity is right here. The certainty about the truth of objectivism really is, and in this case, ethical objectivism, is the doctrine that universally valid or true ethical principles exist. So that's ethical objectivity. Ethical relativism stands in contrast to this. This is something that Pojman is working against. He's working against relativism, ethical relativism, to show that there are ethical principles that are objective, right? Like that you shouldn't torture someone for fun, so on and so forth. Okay, so I think that was helpful, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.